something really interesting happened in the World Cup final. The most attacking player, perhaps in English cricket history, reverted to the type of white ball cricketer that England had been trying to escape from since 1992. Here's Stokes just playing and missing and not really moving the scoreboard on at all. In fact, this is how his innings progressed. This is not excitement and dynamism and power thing, is it? It's just big periods where not much was going on at all. And at one stage, he was 21 from 31 balls. And this was verging on a match-losing innings he was playing so slow, even if they were chasing a fairly small total. But Stokes got them home in the end. Just not at all in the way that they have crafted their brand. Ben Stokes went back to imitating the England batters of the 90s and mid-2000s, and he won them a World Cup by doing it. The truth is that there are many moving parts to the England white ball machine. But first, a bit of a history lesson. If you want to know how far behind England were in terms of ODI cricket, you need to know that they actively fought the white ball. All nations picked up the coloured clothes and white ball at various different times. It wasn't like there was just one moment where they all did it. But England was playing South Africa in 1998 at home in whites with a red ball. It was only at the end of that summer where they would play Sri Lanka and South Africa in a tri-series where they would actually move to white ball cricket. And by then, we'd already had 2 World Cups in coloured clothing. That shows you that in some ways they were behind by choice. And if you look back, you can see that that was also happening on the field. When the Cricket Monthly asked a jury of cricket experts to come up with their greatest ever ODI players, Botham was the only English player who got a vote. Despite the number of times the Botham dancing clip appears on Sky, he wasn't really a one-day legend and probably shouldn't have got a vote. He never took a 5-wicket haul and never made a score over 79. I did analysis on him a few years ago, and based on his record, he was a slightly better player than Lance Cairns. The Forum Cricket Web put up their list of the best 50 ODI players of all time in 2011. And while it's not a professional list, there was a lot of time and effort went into this. And it's certainly one of the better earlier lists like this on the internet. And the highest player on that list from England is Neil Fairbrother at number 47. He's also the only England player on this list. And the only other England players with a genuine case really are David Gower, Alan Lamb, Darren Gough and Ian Botham. If you look at a list of the greatest batters in ODI cricket, you can see that the trend has been to score more quickly over the years. That's not surprising at all. But the players who pop are the ones who score quick for their era while making a lot of runs. The dots clear of their competition are players like Viv Richards and Kapil Dev, Shahid Afridi, Adam Gilchrist, Verinder Sehwag and AB de Villiers. These guys made a lot of runs and they did it fast. And look at all the red dots through this. Gooch, Gower, Lamb, Stewart, Hick, Knight, Flintoff, Trescothick, Collingwood, Strauss, Bell, Peterson, Cook, Bapara and Trott. None of them stand out. If you do a deeper dive on Gower, you'll see that he has an obscenely high rating on the all-time list for the ICC. He's number 4. Even Alan Lamb is number 14. But those are peaks. And if you look at that particular list, you can see that the ICC, for whatever reason, really weights players from the 80s as much better ODI players than any other era. Virat Kohli is the only modern player in the top 7, which doesn't really make any sense, being that ODI cricket is so much better now than it ever was in the 80s. And if you look further than that, Gower averages 30 in ODI cricket, and while his peak was high, his overall career was quite low. Lamb was a better player all the way through his career, even though his numbers don't quite pop compared to the most talented players of his era. It's fair to say he was probably underrated. Darren Gough was a fantastic player, but again, probably doesn't crack the top 50. Though you could make an argument he might have been a better player than Fairbrother, because he does have the 17th best strike rate of ODI bowlers with 200 wickets. I mean, these are all good cricketers, and there were more as well. Paul Collingwood, Jonathan Trott, even during Trott's fault, and Robin Smith. Even early Jimmy Anderson was a quality white ball player. But none of these players really changed the games or truly stood out. And just to go back to that ODI batters list before, you could just see the red dots here, right? Even if you respect these older players and understand that the red ball probably played a part in them making less runs and slower at times, there was just no English dominant white ball players who were world beaters. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing about England early limited overs history is that Adam Hollioake's reign as captain is still talked up so much. That is because England won the Champions Trophy under him in 1997. But it was not that Champions Trophy. It was just a tournament in Sharjah that happened to be called the Champions Trophy. After that, Hollioake would only win 2 more games as a captain. Like Owen Morgan, he was an outsider in many ways, and he had very different ideas on how limited overs should be played. And yet England gave him 14 games in charge. And yet people are still talking about those 14 games. There was so little to hold on to in English limited overs cricket that Hollyoake remained. However, in the 1980s, before Hollyoake, England were a good team. Everyone was playing for second behind the West Indies at this point, but it was England who was in that spot. At that time, people really didn't think that much about limited overs cricket at all. They didn't have a lot of plans or thoughts or preparation. They just kind of rocked up with a hodgepodge set of players and tried to do their best. It's really through Australia in the late 80s into the early 90s that started thinking about one-day cricket. Then New Zealand added to that before Sri Lanka turbocharged it. So the 90s were a completely different sport to what was going on in the 80s. And England went from second to third last, but really second last, as Zimbabwe had only just entered the major part of cricket that decade. And in the next decade, England are above Zimbabwe again, this time Bangladesh, because they've now come into the game, and the West Indies, who are in an absolute freefall towards ODI irrelevance. So for 2 decades, England were a non-issue in white ball cricket. But it is worth mentioning that suddenly in 2010, they took to T20 as they planned for a World Cup, or as we then called it, the World T20. They beat an Australian team, and it was quite clear that England had done a lot more preparing and planning than pretty much any other team at that tournament. And maybe looking back, that was the canary in the coal mine. However, England were terrible over the next 5 years of white ball cricket, so there was no reason to even think about that 2010 victory. In fact, let's not fuck around. England made the 1992 World Cup final and had quite an interesting team when you look back at it. Had a pinch hitter opening the batting, all the way down to number 9 there was batting in that lineup. There was all-rounders everywhere. But from then, until they shat all over the bed in the 2015 World Cup, they were horrible. In games between the top 8 sides, they had a better record only than the West Indies. Yeah, that team that was in complete freefall for almost half of that period. And England was only a small step up from them when you look at this. And because they won that T20 World Cup, you might think they were slightly better in that format. But they really weren't. They were a 50-50 team there at best. In the entirety of the white ball era of cricket up until 2015, England was a shit team. And if you weren't sure how bad they were, when Dave Tickner and Peter Miller made a book about the history of England in limited overs cricket, they named it after a zombie movie. But of course, from 2015 until now, it's all been completely different. They are twice as good as they were before, and they have also added 0.6 runs and over to their batting in T20 cricket in that time. But they've been a far better one-day international team, where they went from a 50-50 team to one of the most dominant sides we have ever had in one-day international cricket. And along that journey, they've started scoring a run and over more than they did before. So, what has changed? Well, let's just start with the fact that they actually prioritized it. They're probably the first major international team to really think and plan and prioritize white ball cricket, even to the detriment of Test cricket. The only other team I could think of was perhaps New Zealand, who once did it. They didn't put this amount of money, planning, and time into it. And considering in England it had been such an afterthought, it literally went from something they found under the sofa to the most important thing in the world. The people involved were, of course, Andrew Strauss, who was the director of cricket, who certainly put the white ball front and centre. They appointed Trevor Bayliss, who was essentially a white ball specialist coach, to take over their team. Owen Morgan got a lot more power because he actually had some valid ideas. And Nathan Lehman, who was already the analyst, sort of got an upgrade. And it was quite clear that his ideas were now playing out on the field consistently. And what did that look like? Well, their top order smacked the hell out of the ball. Their middle order rotated the strike at better than a run of ball in one-day cricket, which had never been done before. And they batted all the way down to number 11 at times. And you may have heard things along the lines of, number 7s don't face that many balls in T20, so it doesn't really matter who bats there. And that is certainly something that many teams try. Hello, South Africa. But who bats at 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, and hell with England, sometimes 11, does make a big difference. But if you actually look at England in T20 matches, and you look at number 7, their number 7s actually face less balls per match than others. So why does it matter? Because the England top order are told to attack, and then when they look at their batting card, they think, yeah, I can take risks because there is so much insurance here. And the weird thing is that they have managed to attack without losing that many wickets. The other thing that England did was they really backed their all-rounders. If you have one player who can bowl 4 overs in your top 6, it's incredibly handy. Between Moeen, Stokes and Livingston, England should easily be able to cover at least 6 overs per innings all the time, which means that they can also pick bowlers who can bat more. And if you look, they've got a lot of those too. Sam Curran, Chris Jordan and Chris Wokes. That's not just having all-rounders, that's having all-rounder versatility. And they even have backup options. David Willey has been there and thereabouts. Will Jacks is probably going to come through. Perhaps George Garton as well. They've tried Lewis Gregory, Liam Dawson. They made Joe Denley bowl once. I'm not sure since late 90s South Africa have we seen an international team with so many options with bat and ball. But the difference between the South African teams and the England teams is the variety. You've got left arm and right arm pace. You've got off spin. You've got Liam Livingstone doing both. They just have incredible flexibility. And some of that is luck. But they also had to back their batters to attack. There was a thought for a long time that Bayliss had just freed up a bunch of wild stallions and told them to go out there and whack it. And I think that's what they actually started to do. But that's certainly not what their plan is anymore. A little bit like the West Indies, the England team hunted matchups and short boundaries. But the difference between the two cultures was that the batters in England were usually a lot more rounded and had played a lot more professional cricket, especially first class and list A. So they had fewer flaws and just had played much more top level cricket. But it's also the way those batters have been used. Cricket used to be far more flexible with when batters were sent in. As we got more specialist batting talent, we started adhering to the tyranny of the batting order. It doesn't actually make much sense, even in a test match. The player who is needed to go in first drop when a wicket falls in the first over is probably not the same guy you want to go out there at 200 for 1. In T20 cricket, there is even more hyper-specialisation amongst the players. So you really want to use your players when the matchup or the game situation dictates, and not a silly card that you filled in beforehand. And with the ball, England are maybe even more dedicated to algorithms. Nathan Lehman obviously used a system that I always wanted to try and was a bit annoyed that he got there first, showing coded information to teams on the field. And at times, Owen Morgan would follow almost every one of those. I remember one ODI in the West Indies where Chris Gayle was smashing England everywhere. And so Adil Rashid just didn't bowl. They hung on to him for over after over and actually looked at one stage like they may not bowl him at all in that game. And finally in the 34th over, with Gayle still out there, they just had to bring him on. And so what did Rashid do? He bowled wrong-ons wide outside off stump. England in the field are very much like how you would play a cricket computer game. And just on the bowling, I think there's something that's really interesting there. They obviously eventually moved on from Liam Plunkett. The big man had taken so many guys dragging his cross-seamers out to the leg side boundary that there wasn't much left in his legs. And so they instantly turned to Mark Wood for those same overs. But he obviously bowled them in a completely different way. But that didn't matter because they'd already been grooming him for that position. All they needed was wickets. It didn't really matter how those wickets came. And so Wood bowled faster and shorter than Plunkett had. But the other big problem, of course, was they needed a death bowler, especially with Jofra Archer out. In that way, the part was different, but the outcome was the same. But their biggest problem after the last World Cup was obviously death bowling. And so what did they do? They rebuilt Sam Curran algorithmically. I've obviously done a whole video on Sam Curran, which you can go and have a look at. But I want to point out something very clear here. From 2012 until whenever Jasprit Bumrah took his crown, Mitchell Starc was the best white ball bowler in the world. Sam Curran has never been anything like that. In ODI cricket, he was below average. In T20s, he was a slightly better than handy bowler, and he got a lot of games, at least in part because he had batting skills. But these bowlers both turned up to this tournament slightly different than the traditional models of what they have been. Part of this is because they've both been learning how to use the wobble ball, and so they don't swing the ball as much as they used to. But England turned an all-rounder who profiled as a power play bowler and made him into a death guy by simply getting him to bowl very straight and full when there was a long boundary behind him. And when the ropes were out square, he would bowl short and at the body. And if he was going to bowl length, mostly it was going to be slow balls. And what did Australia do with Mitchell Starc? Well, just before the World Cup, they took him away from the new ball. Then when the World Cup started, they gave him the new ball. Then that didn't go very well, so they took the new ball away from him again. And then eventually, they just took him out of the side. While all this was happening, Sam Curran was on his way to being named player of the tournament. England give their players all the information and tools possible to be the best they can. Other teams simply do not. Yes, it's robotic, but it's producing results. And you can see how algorithmic it is. For over 5 years, England never once won the toss and batted first in a T20 international. That's true. They looked at the numbers and they realised that there was an advantage of batting second, and they went with that every time. And how did they lose the 2021 World Cup semi-final? By batting first. So there was a bit of an error in their machine. It doesn't actually make sense to bat second every time you get a choice, especially if you're good at it, because it means you won't get enough practice batting first. But then again, being that most teams actually ask you to bat first, it probably all washes out. But England were already good at batting second, and you can see that they started changing it up. This is an important thing, because England haven't been successful in white ball cricket over the last 6 years by just doing one thing. Yes, they try and hit a lot of boundaries. Yes, they try and take a lot of wickets. But there's flexibility in the way they do everything. They're not looking for one method that will work everywhere. They're looking for multiple methods. Why does that matter? That's how you win World Cups. You can't have one method. You need a lot of options. And we have talked about the many things that they did on purpose to get this good. But what about one of the happiest accidents? The ECB started a competition and then shelved it because it didn't really make sense to anyone at the time, myself included. In 2009, England rehashed their old John Player League and made it into a Pro 40 competition. Yes, 40 overs. It lasted until 2013, and people were always a bit confused by it. There was T20 already, 50 overs was quite obviously the one-day international format, but it would turn out that that Pro 40 competition would have a huge effect on the team that England would go on to be. In fact, when I started doing research on the Pro 40, almost every time I came across a scorecard, I found a current England white ball gun having made a big, fast score. It was kind of spooky. The Pro 40 was this incredible combination of small England grounds, incredibly flat pitches, and a freedom that you didn't have in the other formats. And you couldn't just hit, you had to be more rounded, and you couldn't knock the ball around as other teams were scoring so fast. So it meant that you needed to grow both skills in this kind of a new hybrid. And I have no idea what the highest score was in that competition, but I found this old scorecard when Sussex made almost 400 in 2011 from their 40 overs. But I found this old scorecard when I was doing my research. Sussex made almost 400 from their 40 overs. This is in 2011. And who was opening up for Worcestershire that day? Moeen Ali. And he made a lot of runs very fast, and his team failed in only making 319. So I eventually found a way to scrape as much of the Pro 40 data as I could find. And I watched that tournament, and I knew how fast the scoring was. And even then, I was shocked at what I found in this research. This is the major English batters of this white ball revolution and how they went in that Pro 40. And remember, 2013 was the last year. Look at some of the years that these guys were having. There are 25 seasons here where these players averaged more than 30. And 17 of them, they had strike rates at better than a runner ball. There are 7 where they're averaging over 50 at better than a runner ball. You can see that some of these years, they barely fit onto this page. Butler had 3 seasons that are just simply unbelievable. Morgan has one up there with him as well. But almost every major white ball batter of any prominence in English cricket had at least one awesome year in the Pro 40. And yes, it finished in 2013. And yet, in 2014, leading them into the World Cup at that stage was Alistair Cook as their captain. He was slow for his era, or really almost any era. Although I did see that in Pro 40 for 1 year, even he scored at a runner ball. But when you look at where he was and where Jos Buttler would go on to be, it was an obvious decision to move on from him. Alistair Cook was an easy player to let go. But Joe Root was not. This was their best batting talent since, colour TVs. He was a child of T20 as well, and the guy who played absolutely breathtaking innings at the World Cup in 2016 against South Africa. In fact, if you go through his T20I career, you'll find a few incredible knocks, like his first ever score, which was 90 from 49 balls against Australia back in 2013. However, for England, if you check the innings he faced 10 balls, he only passed a strike rate of 153 times and was under a runner ball just as many times. His career strike rate was 126. I think there is little doubt that he had the ability to be a top-level T20 player along the lines of Williamson and Smith. But he didn't have the time. And some of this was probably also forced by the fact that he was never given an IPL deal, which is odd because I think he's probably a better player of spin than Williamson or Smith. And Root was worried about this. At one stage, he even flirted with the Big Bash for a little while. And what is odder about all this is that Root went from playing a lot with Yorkshire as an opening bowler who batted pretty well to someone who only played a lot of T20 in 2016 because England had a World Cup that year. So the choice was made that he would never play enough T20 to develop into the kind of player they needed and wanted, a faster scoring anchor. And so they turfed him. You know, if England had continued to be a patchy T20 side after that decision, which they were even after they took over ODIs, you know what everyone would have said. Where's Root? But they got better without him. Jarrod Milan and now Ben Stokes can do that role better than he can. Stokes does it with more bowling, and Milan does it with a lot more practice. And when you look at England's overall success, it isn't just this win and the 2019 win. From the 2016 World Cup to now, they've been in the semis or finals in every white ball tournament. And they won this one without Archer, Bairstow, Wood, Topley or Milan. Like, they can be better than this. And this isn't a team who just picked up a bunch of random attacking players. Any side can do that. They set up a system. They changed their pitches. They encouraged lower levels to do the same. They used their line squad as a proper development tool. They would go on tours with a squad full of left-arm seamers just to see if there was one that was worthy for the next World Cup. They systematically went about improving every single part of their white ball cricket. They picked people on talent, but then they molded them into specific roles that they needed to fix. And they were willing to drop their legends. The best dynasties in cricket have always come through professionalism. The West Indies became legends through club, county, and then Kerry Packer all paying them. The Australians through central contracts and academies. And even if you look at the West Indies T20 period, that came on the back of their players being the backbone of the franchise system around the world. England have been cricket's most professional side for quite some time now. And yeah, we laughed at their dietary plans and mocked some of the things that they did off field. Like Andrew Strauss once put his stuff in a self-help book called The Secret. And England used the Myers-Briggs test to better understand their players. Like, not everything has worked or even made sense. But they have been turning over every single rock they can. And that has changed their cricket entirely. We saw a brief flare-up from their test team when it went to number 1 before it went away. Now we have whatever Bazball is. But what they're doing in the white ball cricket seems far more robust. And it's not as if all the luck has gone their way either. If Carlos or Darryl had held out in either of the T20 World Cups before this, they might have already won 2 or 3 titles. And they do all this without that many all-time great players. It really is the entire machine, not just a bunch of great players all coming together at once. And the truth is, whether it be 2019's win or this win, we still haven't seen them at full form yet in a World Cup. Around the 2017 Champions Trophy defeat, it looked like this team was just going to try and hit their way into victory. They have moved on so much from that original thought. How much? Well, the most attacking team in cricket history to win this World Cup, they turned their biggest, baddest basher into a mid-2000s strike rotator just so they could win this tournament in 2 different innings. They are currently better at attacking and anchoring than other teams. That is some incredible machine.